gonna give it a second. It's not popping up yet, although people are probably hearing this in my experience on YouTube. All right, so it looks like we're live. Welcome everyone to this session for QGIS North America. My name is Michelle Tobias, and I work at University of California, Davis in the data lab, which is part of the UC Davis library. And this is a shop where we do a lot of data science and also spatial data science with our team there. I'm going to be joined today in the Q&A session by Scott Sibbett, who is a professor at University of New Mexico. And then I also have a note here that this presentation is also made possible with the help of Darcy Bostic, who is a grad student also at UC Davis. Today I'm talking about old train maps, the many routes of California's Central Pacific Railroad. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, the Central Pacific Railroad is a section of the Transcontinental Railroad that went across the US, making travel possible in a much quicker fashion for folks. Sorry. Thought using PowerPoint or using PDF was going to make my life easier, and apparently not. So the goals of this project, I'm really just going to give an overview. This was a really big project, and so I'm going to touch on just the high points of this and rely on you guys to ask questions if there's something I miss that you really want to know about. So the goals of this project are really to help us understand what is the route logic of this route. So why did they put the Central Pacific Railroad where it is? And how did the plan change over time? So we're going to be looking at 3 time points through various map collections and see how this has changed and try to interpret why it changed, like what was going on here. And I think it's a pretty interesting project. So our methods, I'll get into some more detail, but just a quick overview of the methods for this particular project. A lot of this is basically a standard georeferencing data creation type exercise. So the first step in all of this was image preparation. So we were scanning maps and then pre-processing them in GIMP. And then after that, a lot of the maps needed to be georeferenced so that they could be put into a GIS and overlaid with other data. And then also, finally, we're digitizing the railroad route from those maps that were georeferenced. And all of that was done also in QGIS. So the georeferencing and the digitizing is all using standard QGIS tools. So the georeferencer and then the digitizing tools. So you guys want to see maps because this was titled old train maps. So here we go. There are a lot of maps in this project. There's actually 21 maps, 21 separate maps that went into this. And it was a significant amount of work getting these all in and working with them. So the first set of maps is what we call Judas Vellum map. This is actually, it's presented as 4 separate maps, but when you really dig into it, there's actually 6 map segments on this. It's actually one continuous 66-foot long sheet of vellum. So it's a massive roll of vellum and it's 4 separate map panels and 2 of those map panels have two map sections within those. If that doesn't make sense what I just described, I'm going to show you a map of the maps later and that will help. So these maps were already scanned by Stanford University and they're available. I know you can't click on this link in the image, so I went ahead and put the link in the description of this video. So if you scroll down on the description page, you'll see the links for some of the stuff I'm going to reference. So we got the map pre-scanned from Stanford and we ended up cutting it apart. So there's those 6 segments. And then we ended up, this is actually 2 separate sections of map. There's a gap in the middle. So we mosaic the 2 sections that go together and then georeference those. And again, if the geography of that doesn't make sense, it will when I show you the map of all of the maps. So the second set of maps we looked at is from the same time period as that first set. So this is 1861. This is sort of the proposed plan for where the railroad will go. And I mentioned that there was a gap in that first set of maps. We actually were able to find a set of 10 maps, completely different style. So these are 10 individual maps that can be tiled together, and they precisely fill that gap in the first set of maps. So given the style of the maps, the cartographic style, and the fact that they fit in that gap geographically, we believe that these maps go together. They're authored by the same person, and they're from the same time period. So these ones we had to have scanned. The California Secretary of State's archive did that. This is where the maps are housed. They were scanned at 600 DPI. And then we mosaicked these 10 maps together into one continuous image in GIMP. And then we ended up georeferencing those. So you can see in this map, there's not a lot of tie points available. There are some pieces of information like roads in this section, but a lot of the other maps that go with this one don't have a lot of available tie points. And so mosaicing them together first facilitated us georeferencing it, because then we had collectively more tie points. You may also notice that there is township and range marks on this particular map. But it turns out that almost all of the township and range lines that are on all of the maps that we have for this project were estimated because they had not finished surveying all of the township and range sections. So the author of the map calculated where they should have gone if everything was correct. But it turns out that these are not precisely where the township and range sections ended up. So these marks are not helpful for us for georeferencing. We learned that the hard way when things showed up in really strange places. So then we have a second time period. This is one map, actually, not a set of maps, that covers the entire Central Pacific Railroad for sort of the second set of plans. So this is for 1868. So at sometime after that first set of maps was completed, the author of those maps, Theodore Judah, ended up contracting a tropical illness on a trip through the Panama Canal going to the east coast of the US, and he passed away. So his assistant Montague took over this process of planning where the railroad would go. And he made this map. And I don't know about you, but I really can't tell too much about what matches and what doesn't match based on just looking at these maps. So this is one of the reasons why we're scanning and georeferencing these. So this giant map, it is quite large. Not as big as the vellum map, but still pretty big, is also from the California Secretary of State's archive. And they were able to scan this one only at 400 DPI, because if they tried 600 DPI, it was too big of an image. So they sent us this one scanned a little bit less, but you can still see that it's pretty readable. It's pretty good quality, especially for what we need. And it's even better quality than what you can see on the screen, just because I was taking screenshots so I wouldn't make this PowerPoint presentation too large. So again, this one is just one map. It covers everything. So we just had to georeference this one. But you can kind of see from this inset, there really isn't much detail here. Like, we can't reference the city of Truckee because we don't know if this is precisely where Truckee is. And we don't know, where would you put that point within the city of Truckee compared to even an older map. It's just not, there's just not that much information. We also learned that a lot of the river confluences here, like you might say, oh, we'll just use the intersection of these two rivers. The river placement in these maps is really not that precise, so they're not really good tie points either. And then finally, our last time point for this analysis was the USGS topo maps from 1891. And we're considering this the as-built location of the railroad. So by 1891, this was completed, and we're assuming that it was in roughly the correct spot for where it was first built. These maps were fortunately already georeferenced by the USGS, so we didn't have to do any georeferencing on those. But as you can see, these ones have a lot more tie points available, so they seem to be referenced very well. They match up pretty well with modern layers that we can bring in to compare them to. So we thought that it was perfectly fine to use the work done by the USGS. We trust that they specialize in this kind of work. So we were glad to not have to georeference these 4 maps. But so we ended up with 21 maps total with various states of needing to be georeferenced. We had some common issues between all of the maps that needed georeferencing, mainly tie points. So when you're georeferencing, you're matching up points in the scanned image and then points in the real world. But there weren't that many in the maps that represented mostly the planning type map documents. The points that were available were concentrated around the railroad, so that doesn't give us a really good spread the way you want points to be spread out in a process of georeferencing. And then also, like I mentioned before, the public land survey system, township and range sections were inaccurate for most of the maps. And we understand why that was, but it was pretty big letdown to find out that those weren't going to work, because when we saw them, we're like, great, we have layers, we know where these things are, this is going to be easy. And then it turned out, no, they don't work. We have to come up with something else. So our solution was to go ahead and use tie points on the railroad itself. And that's tricky because we know that the railroad was not the same, and we're trying to do an analysis where things have changed. So we limited ourselves to points on the railroad that we knew were the same. So there's some pretty characteristic twists and turns on the rail line that we knew matched up. Also looking at the topo layers, we were able to see that they're pretty, in some sections, there's really not any choice besides where the railroad ended up. So in those sections, we were able to use railroad tie points. The other thing that we did that made things work out a little better was using a thin plate spline transformation. So that is more of a what they call rubber sheeting, where you can kind of manipulate the image a lot more and have more bends and twists and turns to that paper. Originally, we tried to limit it to a first order polynomial, but because of the fact that these are mostly technical engineering drawings and they're not projected and weren't accounting for the topography and things like that, the thin plate spline actually gave us a much better result. So I was pretty resistant to making that change, but we ended up doing that, and I think it really helped. The final step was digitizing the railroad and tracing the railroad in each set of maps. And we use the standard QGIS digitizing tools for that. That was probably the easiest part. And then the result of this is locations for the railroad at 3 time points that we can compare. So this is the map of maps and also the rail line as well. So if you noticed, all of the maps that I showed you previously had colors around them. They're outlined in certain colors. And so those colors match this map. So when you go back through the presentation, you can notice that and reference it. But so you can see that if you look at this section here, the red line is that first set of maps that I showed you. I mentioned that there was a gap in there. These yellow maps, that second set of maps I showed you, fit precisely in that gap. So we treated that as one continuous section for 1861. And then you can see that the scale of the Montague map, the one from 1868, is much different. It's a very large map and it covers a very big area all in one map. And then the USGS maps are the typical tiles you're used to seeing with, the 1-degree quads. So you can see that there is some discrepancy at this scale, at least, in the railroads. Like the 1861 rail line ends between Lincoln and Auburn. But in the later plans, it extends all the way into Sacramento. Some quick close-ups to show you some of the things we're dealing with. This is that end section where the red 1861 plan ends, kind of in the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to connect with another railroad. That was the plan. But as you can see, they've changed the plan and had it go into Sacramento. And you can see that there are some parts where it doesn't agree, but for the most part, we've got a pretty good agreement between sort of plan 2 and the as-built later time point. This particular map is useful for a discussion of the fact that we didn't have tie points in some places. So here the 1861 plan is on the other side of a river valley from where it actually got built. And because there are not many tie points in this area, it's kind of a very unpopulated area, very scenic, probably for the railroad. We didn't have any tie points, and the rail line doesn't match up with the as-built rail line at all. So you can see how there are these squiggles that, just really don't line up with the topography. In this section, we know that the georeferencing is a little bit off. I would expect that these wiggles in the rail line would line up fairly well with the topography, and the rail should kind of hug the curves on the topography, but it doesn't. And that's because we didn't have tie points there. So when we were talking about our analysis in the paper that we wrote for this, we just had to say, look, it's on the other side of the river valley, and we can't really discuss much more of that. We expect that the discrepancies that we're seeing is just because our georeferencing was not as good as it was in other places. And then I just like this map because it kind of shows how things had to change for practical reasons. So in 1861, the plan was to take the train into Cold Creek Valley here. And one of the things when you're building a train route is you can't have the train go over too steep of terrain. So as the plan evolves, they've realized that this area where it was going to cross the creek is still too steep, and they've had to extend the rail line into Cold Creek Cold Creek Valley a little bit further to avoid having the train go over too steep of an area. So this is just one section where you can see that there's fairly good agreement in other places. Like, yeah, there's some wobbles, but that's really not a big deal in terms of where the rail line got put. But here is a big difference that we can look at and kind of understand a little bit more how this was built and why it was built. So a little bit of conclusion and wrap up here for what I've shown you. The reason that this is important is because this is the very first time that these maps have been overlaid at the same scale. So you saw from that other image, the map of maps. These are very different scales on the map. There's multiple sheets to a lot of these collections, and seeing it all together really hasn't been possible until we can scan these, georeference them, and put them together. One of the other powerful things is that we're overlaying this with other data. So we're overlaying it with the modern USGS topo maps and with contour lines, and we can start to understand better what's going on in these maps by using some of these other data sets that, you know, are centuries apart at this point. So the really important thing is that we're able to learn new things and tell new stories by going through this process. And yes, georeferencing was a major challenge. Darcy and I think we estimated that each of these maps got georeferenced at least 10 times each, trying to find a viable method that was going to work and give us good results. So it was time consuming, and definitely I would say with this kind of map, you're never going to be perfect. You're never going to get precisely the map to sit where you think it should, but it's still worth doing, even if you've got a little bit of wiggle. As long as you understand how to interpret that data that you're generating, you're going to get something useful out of this and learn something new, even if it's not perfect. So I would say if you're thinking about doing this and you're a perfectionist, you might have to let go of that a little, and you know, you're still going to learn a lot. And I have a little note at the bottom here that throughout this whole process, I kept thinking, like, what would the people who made these maps think about this process? This must look like magic, you know, to someone who probably never even thought of a computer at all. This is a pretty cool process to take all of these maps and put them together. So a quick set of thank yous to Curtis Carroll, who contributed a lot to this research. The California Secretary of State's Archives for their help with finding maps and scanning them. Also the UC Davis Library and Data Lab, they provided a lot of support in terms of space for meeting and infrastructure and things like that. To the Maptime Davis crew who've seen this project as it's been going forward and letting me brainstorm with them. They've been very helpful, especially in devising next steps that are going to happen after this particular piece that I'm showing you today is what comes after this. And Stanford Library for sort of kicking this off and scanning a really cool map so that we all have access to it and can play with it. And again, the link to that one is in the description of the YouTube video. So if you want to get a hold of that and play with it yourself, that is available in a couple different forms. So I think with that, we're just about ready to answer some questions. And out of the corner of my eye, I've been seeing the chat kind of tick up. So I know we've got some, just so you guys know, I'm on about 20-second delay from what you're seeing. So if you start typing in your questions now, then we'll see those in another half a minute or so. I don't know if Alex or Keith can help us with some questions that have already been asked, stuff we should talk about.
Yeah, we've got a couple of sets of questions.
Okay.
The first set of questions revolve around how common are these types of maps? Are they likely to exist for other railroads? And do you plan to do this for other railroads?
Wow, that's a lot of questions. So maybe Scott can help. So we've got Scott Sibbett here, one of my co-authors. So he can probably help answer some of the questions. I'm going to switch us to not screen sharing so you can see both of us. So Scott, can you help us understand about how common these maps are?
Well, the 21 maps that we were looking at are unique. There are only one copy of them. In fact, that's why Stanford digitized this very long, 66-foot long map, biggest thing I've ever seen. It's pretty spectacular. So it's conceivable that there are other historical maps by other railroads. I'm not aware of any set like this. And I think we were quite fortunate to have been able to fill the gap within that 166-foot long map. That made it a much tidier story. In terms of, are there maps elsewhere? There are some great map libraries out there. Yale Beinecke, the Bancroft, Huntington Library, UT Austin, Harvard's got great maps. I think that it's quite possible. California State Railroad Museum has lots and lots of railroad maps of the state of California in particular. And in fact, there is a little more interest, I think, in terms of amplifying this type of research to other railroads, particularly if you stick to mountainous areas. I think when they were running new railroad lines across the United States in the Midwest, pretty straightforward where you're going to stick a line. And there's a lot of straight track, whereas it was much more difficult to cross the Cascades and the Sierras and the Appalachians. That's probably areas where it would be fruitful to go look at. At this time, Michelle, I don't think you and I have really chatted about looking at other railroads. It's a possibility though. What do you think?
I think it would be really awesome. I think, and if other folks out there are interested in sort of teaming up and, working together on other areas to create sort of this, maybe a database of historic railroads that haven't been digitized. I know there are probably quite a few that have been, but, we're happy to, share some expertise and work on some more of this. I think it's quite fascinating. And the fact that now it's digitized, you can bring in other pieces of information from other places and put new stuff together. I think that's really valuable. So the more the merrier, I say.
So we've got another set of questions about how many people did the georeferencing, how long did it take, and when did you decide you were done?
Oh, goodness. For how long it took, I honestly, months. This started with, part of it was because we started with the map, that first set of maps that Stanford scanned. And the original plan is let's just, georeference this and see. And then there was more maps got added and more maps got added. So it took months to get through that, mostly just because we were refining our methods. And I think by the time that we came to the point where we were doing the pre-mosaicing in GIMP and then georeferencing, I think we realized that the quality of that process was a lot better than what we had seen with the other processes, like trying to do the maps individually. Stuff lined up better. And so I think by that point, honestly, we were a bit tired. And so part of that was just like, we need to be done with this. You could go on forever trying to make this perfect. And if you've ever georeferenced a map, you could spend, even when you finally have decided you're done, you could probably spend another week doing it and still not be happy. So this just kind of came down to, we're not making substantially better data the more we work, and it just kind of, the returns kind of slowed down. So, but it was the georeferencing was me and Darcy. We realized at some point, we had, 21 maps that we needed to get some more hands on deck. So I put a call out to our community at UC Davis and asked for some grad students who wanted to participate, and Darcy wanted to join us. So she was a huge help in getting this done. And, having two brains thinking about the methods on this was much better than just one. So that helped. I think maybe we've got time for one more question if there is one, and then we got to wrap up. So is there any?
The other big theme was, were there plans to do field verification of any of this data?
Oh, we can't field verify it because this is from 1861. I don't have a time machine. So as you can see, like some of the railroad really is in a really similar place. But we trust the USGS map, really. That's really what our baseline was for how well things line up. So I don't know, Scott, do you have any thoughts on how we could ground truth this?
I think you're right. I don't think we can go back in time.
Yeah, so I mean, like some of it we could, because really some of the line is in pretty much the same spot, but I don't think we really need to ground truth it to be able to say that we, for our purposes, this is good enough. We're not looking to like that precise of an analysis with this. It's not an engineering program. No one is going to die if it's not in the exact right spot. So so we can't really ground truth it. Sorry, that was probably a little bit more flip of an answer than you were expecting. So I think with that, we need to wrap up. Thank you, Scott, for joining me, and thanks to the QGIS North America team for putting this together. I'm on the committee too, but there's a huge team that, well, not huge, but a big enough team that's working to make this happen. So thank you all for that. And thank you for those of us joining us on YouTube and for your great questions. And I'll probably pop over there after today and answer some more that didn't get answered. So thanks. I'm going to go ahead and end here. And hopefully we'll see you. Oh, I should mention that the next session is actually about doing sort of the pre-processing on this. So scanning and using GIMP to do mosaicing and things like that ahead of time. So go to the conference website and find the link for that.